In the US, we're the only ones to hold on to Z. It's Z everywhere else.
Suzanne, what do you think the impact of language is going to have on Gen Z or Gen Z as they enter the workplace?
Gen Z or Gen Z is coming into the workplace with different language habits in some areas and different expectations than their older colleagues. And I have a lot of leaders who talk to me and are very nervous now because they're being held to a higher standard of language competence and inclusive language competence by their youngest employees, who both expect them to understand, to be able to speak competently and fluently on gender, on race, on sexual orientation, on other things, and feel very comfortable calling them out, even directly or in a public forum on social media, recording something and putting it on social media. I would say Gen Z or Gen Z is holding leaders' feet to the fire in a way that they haven't been held to the fire before. When it comes to language, it's motivating a lot of people who are afraid of being called out or canceled by people on the internet or canceled by people in their company, to really start paying attention to inclusive language and moving forward with it. Say one more thing, the 6 principles of inclusive language can help people defend themselves, because not every time that you're called out, it's not always for problematic language. Sometimes people are so excited to call out the unfairness that they overextend and call out something that actually isn't problematic. So you can use the principles of inclusive language to have a Gen Z person explain to you exactly where you went wrong.
It's fascinating and a must for all leaders to understand this and really take care about their language and be aware of their language.
Just changing, and there are new standards, and you got to put in the work to meet the new standards.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I do this. My Mac now does this.
Welcome back to Lead to Succeed, and our guest today is Dr. Suzanne Wertheim. Now, Suzanne is a national expert on inclusive language and an international keynote speaker with more than 2 decades of experience researching and speaking about inclusive language. We're going to be taking a good dive into this, Suzanne. Suzanne has a book and it's called The Inclusive Language Field Guide, 6 Simple Principles for Avoiding Painful Mistakes and Communicating Respectfully. So, very big welcome to you, Suzanne. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Rebecca. It is a pleasure to be here speaking with you.
Oh, thank you. Now, when I started reading a little bit about your book and what you do, all around language and the risks around language, how did you get started with this? How did you get into this?
So I am a former professor of a field that almost no one has heard of because we've done the worst job of PR, called linguistic anthropology. And so back when I was still professoring, I would tell people and they'd say, what is it? Or, oh, how many languages do you speak? Or, so it's like archaeology, or people didn't know. But it's really as basic as looking at language and the social meaning that language conveys, language and culture. And in particular, I was very interested during my research period in language and power dynamics. What's going on? What are the subtle hints and messages in language that can leave some people feeling good, feeling heard, feeling seen, feeling valued, and other people feeling unseen, forgotten about, marginalized? And so when I left academia in 2011, I started applying the principles of linguistic anthropology to the workplace and to bias at work and workplace communication. And that has culminated in, so far to date, in the book. I don't want to say it's a permanent culmination, but right now the culmination of that work is tied up in a neat package in that book.
So what do we see today, Suzanne? What do you see in businesses where we might get our communication wrong? What are the things that we need to look out for?
So a lot of people are very nervous about language right now.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I say is that we're just adjusting to 21st century etiquette. So 21st century etiquette is just like 20th century etiquette, but who we think we need to be polite to and respectful of has expanded. So when I was growing up and I entered the workforce in the 90s, it was still okay to be dismissive of all kinds of people, people who aren't heterosexual, people who aren't white, people who aren't in the gender binary. There were so many ways that people were forgotten about or treated in really very disparaging ways. And so, what we need to do in the business world is make sure that we're expanding. We already know how to be polite. We just have to make sure that we know how to be polite to a broader range of people than we were being polite to, let's say, 20 years ago.
But should we not be polite to everybody?
Yes, but historically, it's been culturally acceptable in the dominant culture to not be polite to everybody. And I'll give you an example, which is not business culture. Well, it's business. I lived in Los Angeles for a long time. And so I'm familiar with Hollywood in some respects. I had a lot of people in the industry that I knew. And when I look at the movies of my youth in the 1980s, they were acceptable. I watched them unproblematically when I was young. And retrospectively,
Yeah.
there are horrific things when it comes to sexual assault and treatment of people who maybe don't speak English as a first language, have immigrated from another country, who are not white. Um, Genuinely horrible. They don't hold up well. There's actually similar stuff, not so exaggerated, in business communication too. And I'll say one more thing. I didn't have cable. I don't remember the last time I had cable. So I was very late to the television show Mad Men, which takes place in the 60s in famously sexist Madison Avenue advertising culture. And people are like, oh, you're going to watch it. It's going to be so fun. It's so different. And I watched it and I was like, oh, it's the same. The amount of what was happening today was less. It wasn't as overt most of the time. It wasn't as egregious most of the time. But everything that was being shown on the Mad Men show was something I had found in my present day research on workplace issues. So things haven't changed as much as we think.
Well, I was going to come on to my next question. Things have changed, but where do you think we are on the pendulum from being, going back, 20 or 30 years ago to where we are today? Are we sort of doing things correctly now, or do we still have a way to go?
So this is why coming in with a scientific toolkit about language helps
Yeah.
me really, I feel like I have this gift of X-ray vision where I can see through what was opaque to me before I started grad school. And so what makes language so complicated? There's no other human skill like language. We acquire it differently than any other skill. We store it in our brain differently than anything else. We process it differently. We're on autopilot so frequently. And what happens is there can be this enormous gap between our conscious thoughts, like all genders are equal, or I feel warmly about people of any sexual orientation, or I know that people of all races can have the opportunity to be equally talented and equally skilled. But the language patterns that we produce are often a throwback to earlier times. And so this happens again and again and again, that our conscious thoughts are great. And then when we're on autopilot, our language patterns are sending some pretty bad messages.
That's fascinating. So we've got some clarity in our mind, but our language doesn't represent that clarity. What might be warning signs that you see where, a leader in a business owner might have that clarity in their mind, but their language is off-putting to others or doesn't support others?
Let me focus on the doesn't support others. So I have two linguistic distortions that I found again and again when I look at workplace culture. I call them inflating language and softening language. And they are a major pitfall for leaders, I find again and again. So inflating language is when somebody is behaving reasonably, but because of their identity, their reasonable behavior is described as being problematic. I'll give you some examples. She's so abrasive. Oh, she's so difficult to work with. He's so problematic. He's so difficult, right? For people very often expressing dissent or calling out a problem. So it turns out that for our language patterns, we're comfortable with people in a power position, including socially powerful, expressing dissent or calling out problems. But people that we see as subordinate, and this is people who aren't male and people who aren't white, for the cultures that you're sitting in and I'm sitting in here in the US, right? when people are speaking in a powerful way, expressing dissent or calling out a problem, they're often themselves described as the problem. And then the reverse happens with softening language, where people in a power position behave badly. I see that with sexual harassment, with discrimination, with bullying, or just saying something generally rude or problematic. And because that person has power, they're the CEO, they're the boss, they're the dean of the law school, they're a star performer, or maybe they're just socially dominant. So a white man, their behavior is described in very soft language. Oh, boys will be boys, or he's a good person, or she has good intentions, or oh, they're just curious. These are all things that I've heard described. And so when we have the distortions, what happens is we are describing some people as problematic when they're actually trying to be very helpful to the company. And we describe some people as reasonable when they're actually causing real problems. So that's a thing that I would alert leaders to start looking for. When is there a double standard?
So, do you think that's their biases that are causing that to happen? Because that doesn't sound like they've got clarity of thought.
Yes. Yes. So you can have clarity of thought. I want women on my team to speak up. I want people to be able to talk to me and give me critical feedback.
Yeah.
But then I will tell you that there's this thing that appears to be universal. I have yet to not find it in a culture that I'm getting data from, where if somebody below you is acting above their place, right, is acting in a way that you think is higher than, um, people can get genuinely angry. And it seems to be something about neurology. It fires up some kind of anger. And so a person who might have this conscious thought, I want my team to give me critical feedback. I want my team to point out problems. I want my team to speak up and speak clearly and forcefully. That bias gets triggered when somebody who's supposed to be quote unquote subordinate speaks in the same way. Then it triggers these distortions and anger. So there is that's why I call it a distortion, because you're not seeing things clearly. Your words and your mental models are not in alignment with your very good intentions and your very good conscious thoughts.
Okay, this is great. How do you suggest a leader who might recognize that they do that? I mean, how do we get a leader to be aware of that, step one, and then to address it, step two?
So the first thing is, I think leaders need to demonstrate that they are open to and welcome constructive and critical feedback, because there are things that happen to our neurology as we become fancier and leaders. Even before we become leaders, there are experiments that show that just 15 minutes of being what they call primed to be shown that you are at a higher level will lessen empathy and make it harder to hear people who are beneath you. So leaders have this tremendous challenge where literally their brain and nervous system has tweaked and changed to make it harder to hear people. So the first thing is, how do you make sure that you can get solid, accurate feedback that you don't get angry at? So that's my first thing, is I would say that will set you up for all inclusive language challenges that you face. And then the second thing is, it's going to probably be invisible to you as a leader when you go on autopilot and these distortions show up. But you know who's going to feel the distortion? The person who is on the receiving end and being treated negatively. Either they're having their concerns dismissed or they're being described as the problem. So what I recommend is some kind of open door policy where you ask people and say, here's a thing that I've learned about these distortions, and I don't want that to happen. Can you please help me see at times that I'm not seeing? Because sometimes we're busy thinking strategically. We're trying to get a bird's eye view of the situation. There's so much going on, and there's a very heavy cognitive load anytime we're in a conversation. It's very heavy, and we're so busy thinking about what we're saying and what the implications are in terms of strategy, we often lose track of how we're saying it. And that's where these distortions and what I call problematic language can sneak in. So my top tip is, show yourself to be trustworthy and ask people you trust to give you feedback. And that will always set you up for success.
That's just such a great way to put it, isn't it? It's to put it out there and say, tell me. Like, I want to know if I missed the point or I don't speak in a language that's supportive of you or upsets you in any way. Because it shows that I'm also vulnerable as a leader and I'm also willing to learn.
I would also say it can be so difficult and dangerous to thread the needle of giving feedback to somebody above you when you come from a marginalized group that
Yeah.
already is prone to be dismissed or not thought highly of. That I would also recommend that you don't burden the person who's what I call the target of bias. The person on the receiving end of bias is already being burdened by the bias, and then speaking in a way that educates you without upsetting you might be such a heavy burden on them, that asking a range of people to help you, not just, if I see something problematic to you, please let me know. But I would recommend, if you see me say something or write something problematic, please come to me, right? And that frees it up for people to do ally work. A lot of people ask me, how can I be a good ally? How can I do good ally work? Well, taking the burden off the person who's been wronged and harmed, and helping them, protecting them from that shoot the messenger thing that happens, that's also very human nature. So if you're like, okay, my social standing is good, or my position in this company is high, so I'll come in and I'll take on that burden, that's very helpful. So as a leader, if you start to see it, then you have a superpower, and you can start to help other leaders see it as well, with far less danger for you than there is for people who are lower on the org chart.
Okay. Thank you. I've learned something there, Suzanne. That's fantastic. What would your practical tips then be? You know, it's not necessarily if you're a leader of a team,
Mhm.
but you're a leader within your maybe you work with other CEOs, you get together every so often. How would you relate this to help other CEOs learn about this? So somebody's listening to this podcast, they want to relate it to another CEO. What is the best way to do that?
So I always recommend, if you really want to learn something and make sure you put it into practice for yourself, the best thing to do is teach it to somebody else using examples that you find yourself. And then it lodges in your brain differently. It's like karaoke, and you're singing karaoke and you're like, I know the words to the song. And if there's a malfunction and the words disappear, you're like, oh, I don't
Yeah.
actually know the words to this song. Well, the same thing can happen with inclusive language, right? You can have this very strong passive knowledge in your brain and like, oh, I get it. But when it comes time to either implement it yourself or point it out to somebody else, you're like, uh-oh, I like, it's that the words have disappeared, right? So I recommend prepping in advance and teaching people before you teach somebody fancy, teach somebody less fancy who you think would be open to hearing it. And so whatever it is that you might want to teach somebody, um, let me give you an example. I was thinking about this. This is a very easy example. Here's an example from my own life that is in my book. I had a colleague. We were on an equal level, and she had gone on a date. She was very smiley on a Monday morning. And I said to her, oh, you're so smiley. Did you have a good weekend? And she said, oh, yeah, I had a really good first date this weekend. It seems promising. And I said, oh my God, so wonderful. What's he like? And her face froze. And this is what I'm talking about, autopilot. I know that people date all kinds of people. I know that not everybody is heterosexual. And so luckily, and this is early on in our relationship, and we were just colleagues, we didn't talk that much, but I guess I had shown enough that she could trust me, right? To say, oh, actually, I date women. And I said a string of curse words. And I'm like, oh my God, with my background, like, of course I should know, right? And so here's an example that I would use as a teaching example to say, hey, there's this thing called being heteronormative and assuming that everybody is heterosexual. And it shows up very often in policies, in the ways benefits are worded, in invitations to company parties and company events. It can show up in so many subtle ways. And so you could teach somebody and say, hey, there's this thing called being heteronormative, but we want to use language when we don't know somebody, or even if we know somebody, but we're not sure about what the romantic interest is. Let's make sure that we use language that is more generic. I could have said, oh, tell me what they're like. And it would have been not a problem. And she would have thought, oh, okay. And then she would have said, oh, she's super cute. I met her through this, you know? So if you can find your own example and teach, then it will really land with you. And you might help somebody avoid making that mistake. Luckily, that mistake didn't damage my relationship with my colleague, but it might have in different circumstances, especially if I had said a bunch of other things that made me seem like I just didn't get what her experience was.
Oh, thank you for sharing that, Suzanne. I can imagine how you must have felt at that time. So, what's the best way to handle when we do say something that like that? What's the best way to handle it?
One thing is to not over apologize. So I talked to a number of people who are transgender. I had transgender people read my book to make sure I was getting things right, and transgender readers would be okay with it, and people learning about the transgender experience would be okay. And a thing that I heard again and again and again is the over apology. So people who are transgender very often feel othered by society. They felt othered before their transition. They feel othered after the transition. They're made to feel different and often like a freak and a weirdo. And what happens is people are often misgendered, especially before they start passing, right? So there are some people who are transgender that people don't know because the hormones came in early enough and whatever it is. So you don't know. And then there are some people who are transgender who do not seem, do not read immediately as the gender that they are, right? So a thing that happens is transgender people, especially early in the transition, are very often misgendered, where somebody will use the wrong pronouns like she because somebody looks biologically female, or a woman like you, or whatever it is, like that. And again, I've heard that when somebody over apologizes, it feels as painful as the misgendering because the message, I was talking about hidden messages before. So so to do, oh, I'm so sorry. It's hard, I'm so sorry. It's a challenge to switch to your pronouns because my brain isn't used to it yet, right? Because pronouns are a real challenge. Changing pronouns is a real challenge because we store grammar words in our brain differently. We have the weight of literally millions of times we said only she or only he to refer to a single person. So you can say, oh, I'm sorry, my tongue is behind my brain, and then fix it, right? Or, oh, sorry. And then you work really hard to fix it, right? If you say to somebody, I'm going to fix it, and then you don't fix it, and you just keep on apologizing for 6 months, then that apology is meaningless. So a small apology, and then you put in the effort to fix it. But a don't is A, not fixing it, and B, a huge over apology. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I forgot you're transgender. It's so different. Because that hidden message is you are so different. When people don't want to feel, people want to feel different in the sense of like special or unique, but in terms of community belonging, that's a universal for humans. We all need to feel like we're part of a community. And if the message you're getting from your community is you're actually on the margins, you're outside, you end up feeling really terrible, just genuinely awful.
So, an apology and a commitment to work on it and keep it light.
An apology and a fix in the moment, or an
Yeah.
apology as close to the moment as possible. So someone brings it to your attention later. So you can just shoot a quick email or whatever your preferred mode of communication is. Oh, it's come to my attention that I said this to you. I'm so sorry. I understand that this has this negative impact for this reason. In the future, I'm going to work really hard to not do that. But and don't even say, please call me out. I was about to say, please call me out if I do it, but don't burden that person. Don't burden that person, right? Take the responsibility for yourself.
Yes.
Yeah, quick apology and a fix.
And how much of this are you seeing in the workplace? How many, are people really adopting this, or do you think there's still so much confusion? And we all need to read your book and learn your 6 principles to avoiding um, upsetting people or getting it
Right,
wrong.
right. It's really variable because, as I was saying, the difference between our conscious thoughts and our language patterns. So when I was teaching people at UCLA, I would have them collect slang that was collected in person. And then I would have them read out words. We moved to the gender section. I was doing a section that involved slang, and then we switched subtopics to gender. And I would say, okay, let's talk about slang in a college campus. A lot of people are talking a university campus for UK people, right? So a university campus. At uni, people are talking a lot about altered states, right? So how high they are, or how drunk they are, or they're talking about how attractive somebody is, or how sexually available somebody is. These are very common areas for slang. And so my people at UCLA, they're in Los Angeles, they're elite, they're sophisticated, they're in a global city that's a global producer of world culture. They really felt like they were at the cutting edge. And now to have them read out the slang words they had for women who were sexually available or sexually active. And it would be a very long list. There would be almost no male words, and a very, very long list of extremely disparaging, objectifying, dehumanizing words for women who are sexually active, because policing of women's sexual activity is an ongoing thing, and ignoring men's sexual activity or lauding it is another one. So even people who were young were still reproducing bias in their everyday language, joking around with their friends. They were reinforcing these mental models that we watch women for their sexual activity and we negatively assess them if they're sexually active. This
Mm.
is happening not well, actually, it does happen about sexual activity too in the workplace. And that's one of the reasons why sexual harassment is so often, not always, but so often oriented towards people who aren't seen as female, right? So a lot of people say the young people will save us or the new generation will fix it. But I'm here to tell you that I see things replicating again and again, generation after generation. So the only thing that's going to fix it is shifting to a new baseline. So I see young people very comfortable with pronouns that aren't she or he because they've learned them before grammar gets fixed in your brain around puberty, right? So there are people now in their teens, there are people, my friend's 7-year-old, super comfortable with calling some friends they and some friends he. Super comfortable. So that's a shifted baseline. But there are other baselines that haven't shifted as much because they're lodged in those unconscious language patterns. So I don't want to sound pessimistic. I think that having the conversations like the one that we're having lets people bring to light the language that they're using and look at it and say, does this language spark joy? Is this language aligned with my good intentions? I'm a good person and I want my language to land well. And the more we're consciously fixing it bit by bit, it's like exercise. You can have this idea, I really want to be fit. But if you don't actually exercise a little bit every day, you're never going to change your habits and change how your body functions. Well, you have to do exercises with your language too. It's the only way to change, just a little bit every day.
And what should that little bit every day be, Suzanne?
Ha! Well, I mean, I don't want to be like, buy my book, but here's where I'm going to say, buy my book because I set up the book to be secretly a 6-month course. So that subtitle is I've got 6 principles. I've got 1 chapter per principle. And then at the end, I say, I'm like, read the book through and then go back to each principle. And at the end, I give you things to practice. I give you 5 quick wins that you can start implementing right away. And then there are some things that take a little more work to shift in your brain. And I give you 3 exercises to practice for a month, like an exercise buddy, get a practice buddy, or talk to your pet, find somebody you feel safe with, and you can practice in the comfort of your home with people you feel safe with. So then in the workplace, when the stakes are a little higher, especially if you're a leader and eyes are on you, you feel more comfortable because you're not saying it for the first time in
Yeah.
front of people where it really matters.
Okay. That sounds great advice. And we'll talk about your book shortly, and you can explain to our audience how they can get hold of it, etc. What might be one first step takeaway from this podcast that our listeners could do? We've got leaders, business owners who really commit to supporting their team, growing their business, want to do the right thing. If you would give them maybe 1 or possibly 2 tips to go away and work on or think about, what would those be?
This is a tip that's got a lot behind it, but I would think about the word professional, which is a very loaded word.
Mhm.
And I would sit as a leader and think about, what do I see as professional behavior? And is there a bias in it? Because professional behavior really should be about um, showing up on time, meeting deadlines, being affable, accepting feedback, producing high quality work. You can get very granular about what professional behavior is, but I have plenty of examples from the UK and plenty of examples here where people are told, for example, that they're not professional. They don't look professional because they have hair that is, for example, natural hair, African hair, right? So hair that is not straightened, but is showing up in curls or maybe knots or twists, and people are told, your hair is unkempt, you look very unprofessional, it's disrespectful to show up with this hair, when it's just the natural hair. Some people's natural hair is seen as professional, and some people's natural hair is seen as unprofessional. Also, when it comes to dialects and accents, people are told, you don't sound professional. England is filled with accents where we're very sensitive to the prestige level of the accent. I'm here in the US. I originally spoke a very low prestige accent that people will make fun of on television, is my original accent, and I got rid of it so I could be taken seriously. But I was not less smart just because I said things in that accent, right? So having an idea of what does a professional person look like and sound like, and reworking your image of a professional person to be more expansive, like that 21st century etiquette. How can we rework it so somebody with an afro and maybe a Jamaican accent or a Nigerian accent is still seen as being professional and competent when their behavior is professional and competent? It's a big tip, but it's the number one thing that you can make a huge difference if you really sit with that.
Okay, so can I just replay that back to you to make sure that I've got that right? And it would be to examine your own sort of understanding, or your own what's the word I'm looking for? But your own understanding of what the word professional means, and just examine that and just say, am I off track anywhere in this? And challenge, or maybe do that with a colleague.
Mm.
And
And list 5 professional, list 10, like, so who are 10 people I think of as really professional? And you just list them right off the top of your head, right?
yeah.
And then you look, oh, am I leaving people out from some categories? Are these people homogenous in some way? And you go and you interrogate that and see. So you don't have to do, a lot of people say reflect. Reflection only takes you so far. You got to write things down and do it. Like you got to trick your brain into showing you where
Yeah.
it's maybe not aligned with, again, your good intentions. So yeah, and talk to a friend. Who are some people? And then you look and you're like, oh, am I leaving? Like, are there tattoos? So for younger people, right? So people my age, I'm what we call Gen X here in the States, right? So I started working in the working world in the 90s in offices. So we didn't really have a lot of tattoos, and tattoos were seen as unprofessional in the 90s. But now a lot of people, I work with tech people a lot. A lot of people are very tattooed, right? So do you see people tattooed? Do you see tattooed people as professional, or do you see them as unprofessional? And you can go on and think about it, and then you might have to do some conscious work and start listing people that you left out and you see they're professional and right why, to start expanding your gaze.
That's a great way to do it. I love that. And I think it's challenging our own biases, but we don't challenge them unless we actually look and examine them. Because otherwise we'll just say, oh, I'm going to be biased, but then the language doesn't reflect it.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, your listeners, you have good intentions,
Yeah.
but your language patterns may not be reflecting it. So it's like a good house cleaning, or it's like, posture. A lot of people think you've great posture, and then the first time you see yourself on video, you're like, what? What? So you have to be very conscious then. You're like, oh, shoulders back, head up, like whatever it is. So just like you want to have a certain posture to the world, you want to have a certain language posture to the world, but you got to move it from unconscious to conscious and really take a look and be careful with when you go on autopilot. With practice, you can shift your autopilot so it's aligned with your good intentions.
Well, I'm really looking forward to reading your book. I can get a lot from this. I can learn a lot. And like you say, we have good intentions. We want to make sure our language, our posture, everything aligns with that. And you've made me think deeply about my own language. I'm going to do that exercise with my accountability partner just to make sure that my language does match up with my intentions. That's a great tip. It's been really insightful, Suzanne, to have this conversation with you. And it is an important conversation that all leaders really need to be considering and reflecting on. So, what would you like to leave our listeners with? Next steps, how they might engage with you, whatever it might be.
Sure. So my name isn't super easy to spell, but I'm very easy to find at suzannewertheim.com. So you'll have to see it written and then you can find me. And then through that, you can find my other website. Well, it's worthwhileconsulting.com. And then you can find my book as a great way to carry my years of learning. I just want to share 25 years after I started teaching people about the social meaning and the hidden meaning of language. I feel like I've accumulated so much useful knowledge and I just want to share it with people. And that's what the book is for, right? So you can, and the book is available as an audiobook, it's available as an ebook, and it's available as a paperback. And I'm carried in person in the UK, both at WH Smith and Waterstones and some independent bookstores as well. So you can find the book all kinds of ways.
That's fantastic. Excellent. And I guess ultimately all of this makes the world of work more harmonious and makes our teams make them happier. And we know that the happiness at work stats are poor.
And the thing is, so I do a lot of anti-bias work, and a lot of people feel like anti-bias work only benefits people who are marginalized, right? So I hear like, well, it's only going to benefit Black people, or it's only going to benefit women, or it's only going to benefit. But I'm here to say, I call it the optimized workplace. Inclusive language is part of the optimized workplace. If everyone feels seen, heard, and valued, if everyone feels like they're able to make contributions, if everyone feels psychologically safe to express dissent or bring their ideas, then everyone likes it. Everyone benefits from inclusive language and a workplace that's harmonious and feels welcoming. Everybody. So yeah.
Well, let's get your book, let's learn more. And thank you so much for being an outstanding, inspiring, and very thought provoking guest, Suzanne. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It has been a genuine pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you, Suzanne.